Before the pyramids reached for the sky and statues immortalized pharaohs in stone, Egypt was a patchwork of small kingdoms. Along the banks of the Nile, nomadic tribes began to realize something that would forever change their destiny. The river, with its predictable floods, turned the arid land into a fertile paradise. And where there is food, there are people. And where there are people, there is power. Over time, these communities, known as nomes, evolved into independent kingdoms, each with its own leader, its own gods, and an insatiable thirst for control. But the world does not tolerate many kings for long. Conflicts arose, wars were waged, alliances were forged, and eventually two great powers emerged: Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. For centuries, these two realms studied and battled each other until one leader emerged to end the division. His name was Menes, or Narmer, as some call him. A cunning and relentless ruler, he did not merely conquer his enemies, he wove a new identity for the Egyptian people. With his victory, around 3,200 before Christ, he became the first pharaoh, uniting Upper and Lower Egypt under a single crown, literally, as the double crown he wore symbolized the union of both kingdoms. But unification was more than just a military triumph. Menes established Memphis as the capital, a city strategically positioned between Upper and Lower Egypt, ensuring balance between the two peoples. Under his rule, the foundations of Egyptian civilization were laid. The pharaoh's authority became divine, traditions were standardized, and the first grand temples began to rise. What Menes set in motion was not just a kingdom, but an era, an empire that would endure for millennia, build monuments that defy time, and cultivate a culture that still captivates us today. Ancient Egypt had been born, and its story was only just beginning. If the gods sculpted Egypt, then the Nile was their greatest gift. Imagine a vast, scorching desert where the sun mercilessly punishes the land. Life there should have been impossible. Yet, cutting through the arid chaos, a river winds like a pulsing artery. This river, the Nile, was more than just water. It was the heart of Egypt. Every year, as if obeying a divine command, the Nile overflowed its banks. And what could have been a disaster in other lands was, in truth, the greatest blessing for the Egyptians. The floods carried a dark, fertile silt, a mantle of nutrients that turned the parched soil into lush fields. When the waters receded, farmers found their land renewed, ready to yield harvests of wheat, barley, and flax. Without this sacred cycle of destruction and rebirth, there would be no Egypt. But the Nile was not just a provider. It was also a liquid highway linking Upper and Lower Egypt, connecting cities, temples, and markets. Boats transported goods along its waters, fishermen cast their nets, and travelers journeyed into the unknown. Vessels glided across its surface as if guided by the gods themselves, carrying messages and wealth throughout the kingdom. And the Egyptians knew well whom to thank. To them, the Nile was not merely a river, it was a divine being. They called it Hapi, the god of the floods, depicted as a robust man with a full belly, embodying the fertility he bestowed. In his honor, festivals were held, offerings were cast into the waters, and hymns echoed through the temples, expressing gratitude for the gift of life. Yet, the Nile was not always generous. If its flooding was weak, the land dried up, crops failed, and famine struck the people. If it surged too fiercely, it destroyed fields and villages. It was a reminder that, despite its benevolence, the Nile was a god who demanded respect. In the end, Egypt was not merely a civilization along the Nile, it was the Nile itself. Every temple, every pyramid, every written papyrus stood as a testament to its abundance. And as long as its waters flowed, Egypt would continue to flourish, immortal as the pharaohs themselves. If the history of Egypt were a grand epic, it would be divided into 3 acts, 3 moments when gods and pharaohs shaped the destiny of the land of the Nile. Each one left a legacy that echoes through time, etched into stone, temples, and the secrets still hidden beneath the sands. The Old Kingdom, 2686 to 2181 before Christ, the age of the pyramids. The first great chapter of Egypt was written with blocks of stone and raised monuments that defy the centuries. The Old Kingdom was an era of architectural splendor and stability, where pharaohs ruled as living gods, and the Egyptians firmly believed in eternity. Eternity, a word that materialized in the colossal pyramids of Giza, built to immortalize the kings. The greatest of them, the Pyramid of Khufu, rose like a staircase to the heavens, defying time and the desert winds. But this period was not just about construction. The administration of the kingdom grew stronger, writing became more established, and society was structured rigidly, with the pharaoh at the top, like a radiant sun, while nobles, priests, scribes, and farmers orbited around him. However, even the gods seemed to tire of stability. By the end of the Old Kingdom, a crisis shook the throne. Famine, internal disputes, and the weakening of central power led Egypt into a dark period. The pyramids remained standing, but the order that built them collapsed. The Middle Kingdom, c. 2055 to 1650 before Christ, the Egyptian Renaissance. But Egypt was not made for chaos. With the rise of new rulers, the nation was reborn. The Middle Kingdom was a time of renewal, where art flourished, literature gained strength, and pharaohs became less distant and more connected to the people. The great innovation of this period was territorial expansion. Egypt was no longer an isolated kingdom. It began looking beyond its borders. New trade routes were opened, contact with other peoples increased, and fortresses were built to protect the land. It was also a time of engineering advancements, with temples carved into rock and canals built for irrigation. But nothing lasts forever. The Middle Kingdom came to an end with the invasion of the Hyksos, a foreign people who wielded horses and bronze weapons, technology unknown to the Egyptians. For years, pharaohs watched their lands fall under foreign rule, until a new leader decided it was time to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. The New Kingdom, c. 1550 to 1069 before Christ, the peak of Egypt. Egypt did not just free itself from the Hyksos, it was reborn stronger than ever. Thus began the New Kingdom, the golden age of warrior pharaohs, monumental temples, and names that would echo through millennia. It was during this time that some of the most legendary pharaohs in history ruled. Hatshepsut, the queen pharaoh, who proved that power had no gender and filled Egypt with wealth through trade. Akhenaten, the revolutionary, who defied traditional gods and attempted to impose a monotheistic cult to the sun god Aten. Tutankhamun, whose tomb, untouched for centuries, revealed the secrets of Egypt to the world. Ramses II, the great warrior, who built colossal temples and carved his name into eternity. Egypt, in this period, was not just a regional power, it was an empire. Its borders extended beyond the Nile and its influence spread throughout the known world. But like every star that shines too brightly, the New Kingdom also had its twilight. Gradually, Egypt lost its strength. Foreign invaders, internal conflicts, and emerging new powers eroded its dominance. When the Persians and later Alexander the Great arrived, they found an Egypt still grand, yet weakened. The pharaohs lost their independence, and Egypt came under foreign rule. But to think Egypt died would be a mistake. Its spirit, its culture, and its legacy survived, in the pages of historians, in ruins that defy time, and in the eternal fascination we feel when we contemplate its greatness. If Egypt were a pyramid, not just of stone, but of power and influence, the pharaoh would stand at its peak, touching the heavens, while the base would bear the weight of his glory. Egyptian society was not a chaotic disorder, but a well-defined system where every individual had a role, a function, and a place in the grand mechanism of the empire. The pharaoh, the bridge between gods and men. Above all, the pharaoh reigned, not as a mere ruler, but as a divine being in human form. He did not simply govern, he was the very embodiment of Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept the universe in balance. His power was absolute, his word was law, and his duty was to ensure that Egypt flourished. As a living god, he commanded armies, ordered monumental constructions, and presided over sacred ceremonies. But above all, his role was to guarantee that the Nile continued to flow, that harvests were abundant, and that the gods remained appeased. However, no pharaoh ruled alone. Even a god needs mortals to keep the world in order. Nobles and priests, guardians of the kingdom and the divine fangs. Just below the pharaoh were the nobles and priests, the elite of Egypt. They advised the king, administered provinces, and ensured that the empire did not collapse under its own weight. The priests, in turn, held not only political influence, they had direct access to the divine. In the temples, they acted as intermediaries between gods and men, conducting rituals and safeguarding sacred knowledge. But spiritual power came hand in hand with wealth and influence. Egyptian temples were true fortresses of gold and wisdom, amassing land and treasures, becoming almost as powerful as the throne itself. A wise pharaoh knew that if he wished to maintain his power, he needed to keep the priests close and under control. Scribes and artisans, masters of knowledge and creation. If the nobility ruled and the priests prayed, it was the scribes who recorded everything that transpired. They were the guardians of words, the keepers of knowledge. In a world where few could read or write, they were indispensable. They cataloged taxes, decrees, stories, and prayers. Nothing was official without the ink of a scribe. Alongside them were the artisans, the silent geniuses who turned stone into eternity. It was their hands that sculpted the colossal statues of the pharaohs, painted the tomb walls with visions of the afterlife, and crafted the objects that filled temples and palaces. Their works have withstood the centuries, leaving behind a testimony of Egyptian splendor that still fascinates us today. But if the scribes shaped history and the artisans shaped art, it was the peasants and slaves who shaped the very land itself. Peasants and slaves, the foundation of the social pyramid. The foundation of all this grandeur was sustained by the peasants, the true backbone of Egypt. They cultivated the fertile fields left behind by the Nile's floods, ensuring the bread and beer that fed the nation. During the harvest season, they labored without rest. During the flood season, they were summoned to work on great construction projects, and beneath even them were the slaves, prisoners of war or condemned individuals forced to serve without hope of rising. But contrary to popular belief, it was not slaves who built the pyramids. That task fell to the peasants, called to serve the pharaoh, receiving food and shelter in exchange for their labor. A rigid order, but not an unchanging one. Egypt was a stratified society, where being born into a class usually meant dying in it, but from time to time, fate altered the game. A talented scribe could be promoted, a warrior could be rewarded with land, and a cunning priest could find himself dangerously close to the throne. And so, this great social pyramid stood for millennia, ensuring that Egypt endured, solid and immortal, just like the pyramids that dominated the desert horizon. If there was a place where the gods never slept, it was ancient Egypt. Every sunrise, every gust of wind, every pulse of the Nile was the work of a divine force. Egypt was not merely a land of pharaohs and monuments. It was a stage where gods walked among men, shaping their lives, protecting or punishing those who dared defy them. Egyptian religion was polytheistic and deeply rooted in nature and the cycles of life. What many saw as just a river, the Egyptians knew as Hapi, the god of the floods. The sun that crossed the sky was not a mere celestial body, but Ra, sailing his heavenly bark. Death? Merely a passage into a realm ruled by Osiris, where every soul's heart would be weighed against the feather of truth. Ra, the sun, the creator, the king of the gods. At the pinnacle of the Egyptian pantheon stood Ra, the sun god. He was the essence of life, the creator of all. Each day, Ra was born in the east, traversed the sky, and sank into the underworld at dusk, where he faced the serpent, Apophis, a creature of chaos that sought to swallow his light. But the battle was never lost. At dawn, Ra emerged victorious, and with him the promise of a new day. The pharaohs, in turn, claimed to be the sons of Ra. To rule was their divine right, for who would dare challenge one who carried the blood of the gods? Osiris, lord of death and resurrection. If Ra embodied the day, Osiris ruled the night and the afterlife. He was one of the most revered gods of Egypt, for he carried the promise of life beyond death. Legend tells that Osiris was betrayed and murdered by his own brother, Seth, who dismembered his body and scattered the pieces across Egypt. But Isis, his wife, refused to accept this fate. In an act of devotion and magic, she gathered every fragment, restored his life, and conceived their son, Horus. Yet Osiris could no longer rule among the living. Instead, he became the judge of the dead, the one who weighed the hearts of the deceased against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was light, the soul entered paradise. If it was heavy with sin, it was devoured by Ammit, a monstrous hybrid of crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus. Thus, for the Egyptians, death was not the end but a transition, a new beginning in a realm beyond our own. Isis, the goddess of magic, motherhood, and love. But if there was one figure who transcended death and inspired generations, it was Isis. More than a goddess, Isis was the embodiment of devotion, magic, and hope. She restored Osiris. She protected Horus so he could one day avenge his father. She was not just a wife or mother, she was a cosmic force, a guardian of the mysteries of life and death. Her cult grew so powerful that it extended beyond Egypt. By the time of the Roman Empire, temples dedicated to Isis could be found across Europe and the East. She was no longer merely an Egyptian deity, she had become an eternal archetype. Seth, Horus, Anubis, and the others. Egyptian mythology was vast, filled with fascinating figures. Seth, the god of chaos and storms, was both feared and respected as a necessary force in the balance of the universe. His eternal enemy, Horus, the falcon-headed god, was a symbol of kingship and vengeance, the one who defeated Seth and restored order, and who guided souls on their journey to the afterlife. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, guardian of tombs, ensuring that the dead were properly buried and prepared for their final judgment. Egypt was a land of many gods, each playing a role in the grand theater of existence. And as long as they lived in the temples, in the prayers, and in the hearts of the Egyptians, the cycle of life would continue, like the Nile, which never ceased to flow. If there was one civilization that understood the power of immortality, it was ancient Egypt. The Egyptians did not merely build cities and temples, they constructed to defy time, ensuring that their works would speak for them millennia after their deaths. While kings and empires of the world vanished like dust in the wind, the pyramids of Giza, the temples of Karnak, and the colossi of Abu Simbel stood unshaken, silent witnesses to pharaonic glory. Behind this monumentality was more than stone and mortar. There was faith, there was power, there was the promise of eternity. The pyramids, stairways to the divine. Egypt was always a land of obsessions, and one of them was immortality. The pharaohs refused to accept oblivion. To ensure their souls found the way to the afterlife, they needed tombs fit for gods. Thus, the pyramids were born. The earliest were nothing more than mastabas, rectangular mud brick structures. But one man changed history. Imhotep, the architect of Pharaoh Djoser, had a daring idea. What if a mastaba was built upon another, forming steps leading the king to the heavens? Thus, in Saqqara, the step pyramid rose, the first great stone monument of humankind. Yet the pharaoh's ambition knew no bounds. From the pyramids of Meidum and Dashur, they progressed to Khufu, who sought to surpass all limits and build a tomb that would defy time itself, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Over 140 meters tall and composed of millions of limestone blocks, this engineering marvel was not just a tomb, it was a manifesto of power, a challenge to death. Centuries later, pharaohs abandoned pyramids, opting instead for hidden tombs in the Valley of the Kings. But the lesson had been set. When one builds for eternity, eternity responds. The temples, dwellings of the gods on earth. If pyramids were the pharaoh's houses in the afterlife, temples were the palaces of the gods on earth. Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, each was more than a mere construction. They were gateways between the human and the divine. The temple of Karnak, dedicated to Amun-Ra, was so vast it resembled a sacred city. Its towering columns, over 20 meters high, formed a forest of stone where only priests could walk. Every pillar, every hieroglyph, every carving carried meaning. These were not mere walls, they were prayers etched in rock. In Abu Simbel, Ramses II ensured his glory would never be forgotten. The colossal statues carved into the mountain seemed to defy the very desert. And the most astonishing detail, twice a year, the sunlight penetrated the temple, illuminating the statue of the pharaoh, a perfect alignment of architecture and astronomy. Coincidence? Of course not. The Egyptians knew the secrets of the cosmos and immortalized them in their works. Obelisks and colossi, marks of power. The pharaohs did not build just for themselves. They wanted all of Egypt to remember their greatness. Thus, the obelisks were born, immense stone pillars reaching for the sky, covered in hieroglyphs praising kings and gods. Many were taken to Rome, Paris, and London, but their origins remained Egyptian, and their message eternal. And what of the colossi? The giant statues of Ramses, the colossi of Memnon, the sphinxes guarding the temples. all served a single purpose: to awe, to command respect, to declare to the world that Egypt was immortal. Eternity, carved in stone. The Egyptians did not merely build monuments, they built legacies. Every pyramid, every temple, every obelisk was a statement of faith, power, and eternity. Millennia have passed, kingdoms have fallen, cities have been forgotten, but the pyramids still stand, defying time. The temples still whisper ancient secrets, and as long as the sun continues to rise over the desert, the greatness of Egypt will never fade. If eternity had a language, in ancient Egypt it was carved in stone. Hieroglyphic writing was not merely a means of communication, but a bridge between the divine and the human, the fleeting and the eternal. Each symbol carried a hidden power, a breath of immortality, ensuring that names and stories would never be lost to oblivion. The Egyptians did not see their words as mere strokes on a surface. Writing was sacred, a gift bestowed by the gods. The very god Thoth, deity of knowledge and writing, was depicted as a celestial scribe, recording the fates of men in the great book of the universe. And so, stroke by stroke, the Egyptians built one of the most sophisticated writing systems of antiquity. Hieroglyphs, the language of the gods. The word hieroglyph comes from Greek, meaning sacred writing, and nothing could be more fitting. The Egyptians believed that hieroglyphs had power. When a name was inscribed on a tomb or temple, it became immortal. For as long as it was read, its bearer would continue to exist in the afterlife. But this writing was not composed of letters as we know them. Instead, hieroglyphs blended three elements: logograms, symbols representing entire words; phonograms, signs indicating sounds functioning as syllables; determinatives, icons that clarified a word's meaning. This made reading complex, but also incredibly rich. The same text could be interpreted in multiple ways depending on context and symbol positioning. Hieroglyphs were more than an alphabet. They were art. They were magic. For this reason, they were not used in everyday life. Hieroglyphs belonged to temples, tombs, and great inscriptions that defied the millennia. But daily life required something more practical. Hieratic and demotic, the writing of the people. While priests and scribes engraved hieroglyphs on monuments, Egypt's vast bureaucracy needed a faster way to manage an empire. Thus arose hieratic script, a cursive version of hieroglyphs used in papyrus scrolls and administrative documents. Egyptian scribes were the bureaucrats of their time, keeping records of taxes, decrees, harvests, and legal rulings. Over time, hieratic evolved into demotic script, even more simplified and widely used by the people. It was in demotic that contracts were signed, letters were written, and daily life was recorded. And so, while pharaohs engraved their names on temples for eternity, farmers used demotic script to ensure their tax payments were correct. Two faces of the same civilization, united by the need to express themselves. The Rosetta Stone, cracking the code of silence. For centuries, hieroglyphs were an undeciphered mystery. The secrets of Egypt were etched into temple walls, but no one could read them anymore. That changed in 1799, when Napoleon's soldiers discovered the Rosetta Stone, a stone fragment bearing the same inscription in three scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek. Thanks to this artifact, years later, Jean-François Champollion finally deciphered hieroglyphs, bringing a lost world back to life. Today, ancient Egypt speaks not only through its pyramids, but also through its recovered words. Hieroglyphs are read once more, stories are told again. What the pharaohs carved for eternity has found new eyes to see. Because in Egypt, death was never the end, and writing was the key to eternity. If ancient Egypt was a prosperous empire, it was not because of gold, temples, or mighty armies. It was because of wheat. Yes, the true Egyptian treasure grew in the fields, cradled by the rhythmic floods of the Nile, transforming the barren land into a fertile paradise. Without this, there would be no pyramids, no pharaohs, no priests, only dust and silence. Egypt's economy revolved around the land, planting and harvesting. The Nile was the great provider, but it demanded respect. It was generous when it flooded the fields, but merciless when it failed. The stability of the kingdom depended on the abundance of grain, for where there is bread, there is power. The Nile, Egypt's central bank. The Egyptians did not need rain. They had the Nile. Every year, from June to September, its waters overflowed, spreading nutrient-rich silt across the plains. When the waters receded, they left behind a dark, fertile soil, ready for cultivation. And the Egyptians knew how to use this divine gift. They built irrigation canals, reservoirs, and dikes, ensuring that every drop of water was used to its fullest. Their agricultural calendar was divided into 3 phases. Akhet, flooding, when the Nile overflowed and fertilized the land, planting, the renewed soil was seeded. Shemu, harvesting, the grain was gathered and stored in royal granaries. The pharaoh never touched the land, yet he was seen as responsible for the harvests. If the Nile failed to flood, it was his fault, a sign that the gods were displeased. Famine was not just an agricultural problem, it was a political threat. The fruits of the land. What did the Egyptians grow? Egyptian fields fed not only the people, but also the entire empire. The crops along the Nile sustained everyone, from peasants to the armies guarding the borders. Wheat, the sacred grain, the foundation of bread, which fueled the people. Barley, the key ingredient for beer, as common as water. Flax, used to weave clothing, especially the iconic white tunics of the Egyptians. Legumes and fruits. Garlic, onions, lentils, dates, figs, and grapes were dietary staples. Papyrus, more than just writing material, it was used for baskets, boats, and even sandals. And it wasn't just the land that provided sustenance. The Nile was abundant with fish, hippopotami, and wild birds, complementing the Egyptian diet. Trade, from grain to gold. With such agricultural wealth, Egypt became a commercial powerhouse. Surplus grain allowed pharaohs to trade with other civilizations, exchanging wheat and flax for Lebanese cedar, Nubian gold, Punt's incense, and exotic spices from distant lands. The Nile was not just a source of life, it was also Egypt's trade highway. Boats laden with grain sailed down the river to the markets of great cities, supplying temples, armies, and the pharaoh's warehouses. But trade did not mean currency. Ancient Egypt had no money as we know it. Their economy was based on barter. Wheat, beer, and textiles were the main forms of payment. Want to buy an ox? Pay with sacks of barley. Want land? Exchange jars of beer. And who controlled it all? The pharaoh and his scribes. They knew exactly how much grain was in each granary, how much should be distributed, and how much would pay the workers. Bread and power. In the end, ancient Egypt was not sustained by the sword or by faith, but by bread. As long as the harvests were abundant, the empire remained strong. When the Nile failed, chaos followed. That is why agriculture was more than a profession. It was the backbone of the kingdom, the balance between order and disorder. The pharaoh, in all his glory, was only divine because his people were not hungry. Because in Egypt, whoever controlled the wheat controlled destiny. At the heart of ancient Egypt, science was not a cold, impersonal pursuit. It was a dance between the mysteries of the cosmos and the secrets of the human body, between the stars and the dead. The Egyptians, with their keen minds and skilled hands, became masters of science and medicine, defying time and leaving a legacy that would span millennia. In a land where life and death were intimately intertwined, understanding the human body and the universe was essential. Egyptian medicine was not just practical, it was a deeply spiritual art, for to heal was not just to treat the body, but also to nurture the soul. Egyptian medicine, the body and the soul. Egyptian medicine was a blend of science and magic. Physicians, often priests, saw the human body as a fusion of matter and divine energy, where organs were connected by an invisible yet real network of channels. Thus, when illness struck, it was not just the body that needed healing, but the soul as well. The Egyptians had profound knowledge of anatomy and physiology, gained through mummification practices and careful observation. They understood that blood circulated through the body, that the heart played a central role, and that internal organs were vital to health. Mummification, therefore, was not just a religious ritual, it was an advanced medical technique. Role of physicians. Highly respected specialists in surgery, dentistry, ophthalmology, and gynecology. They treated wounds, fractures, and diseases, using herbal remedies such as honey, garlic, and acacia to heal and relieve pain. Mummification, the art of preserving the body and eternal life. To the Egyptians, death was not the end, but the continuation of a journey. Mummification was the key to immortality, not just a method of preserving the body, but a way to ensure the soul could return and inhabit it in the afterlife. Thus, they developed extraordinary preservation techniques. They removed organs, cleansed and dried the body with substances like natron, a mineral salt, and wrapped the remains in layers of linen. The brain, deemed useless for eternal life, was discarded, but the heart was carefully preserved, as it was believed to be the center of the soul and consciousness. Mummification was not just a technical process, it was a sacred ritual, steeped in religious and spiritual meaning. It was performed by scribes and specialized priests, known as doctors of death, who followed a strict set of rules and traditions. Astronomy, the universe within reach. But it wasn't just the body that fascinated the Egyptians. The sky was their other laboratory, where stars told stories and planetary movements dictated the laws of life and death. Egyptian astronomy was deeply tied to religion and agriculture, for they understood that cosmic order was linked to earthly order. They were keen observers of the heavens, creating a 365-day solar calendar to track the seasons. This calendar helped predict the Nile floods and determine the best times for planting and harvesting. To them, stars and planets were divine beings, their movements guiding the pharaoh's decisions and shaping the fate of the people. But Egyptian astronomical knowledge was not limited to calendars. They built monuments like the pyramids with incredible precision, aligning them with celestial bodies, a reflection of their belief that heaven and earth were inseparably linked. Engineering, the science of building the impossible. And how can we forget Egyptian engineering? The pyramids, those immortal monuments, were not the work of mere hands, but of brilliant minds that mastered physics and geometry. To construct them, the Egyptians developed advanced techniques in calculation, lifting, and transporting massive stones with remarkable precision. They used ramps and a highly trained workforce to move stones weighing several tons. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built with such extraordinary accuracy that even today, scientists marvel at its alignment and symmetry. The legacy of Egyptian wisdom. What is truly fascinating is that, although ancient Egypt has long vanished, its scientific and medical legacy endures. From mummification techniques to anatomical studies, the Egyptians paved the way for future scientists and physicians around the world. They understood that science and religion were not opposites, but rather two sides of the same coin, destined to unlock the deepest secrets of the universe. Art and culture, immortality, captured in colors and stones. If there's one thing ancient Egypt mastered, it was immortalizing the beauty of life and death. Egyptian art was not created for fleeting admiration, but to endure the test of time, transcending the boundaries of mortality. Every painting, sculpture, and piece of jewelry had a purpose, to ensure that divine order was preserved and that the human spirit found peace and honor in the afterlife. With strict artistic canons and masterful technique, Egyptian art became an expression of their deep religiosity and their need to ensure the continuity not just of life, but of the order of the universe itself. Everything was interconnected, for Egyptian art was not merely decorative, it was a means of securing the safe transition of the soul into the afterlife. Art in life and death, from the everyday to the eternal. If you were to step inside an Egyptian home, you would find paintings capturing daily life. Festivities, banquets, hunting, and agricultural work were depicted with a symbolic realism. But this art was more than decoration. Each scene carried profound meaning, representing harmony in life, the continuity of generations, and the blessings of the gods. However, it is within the tombs that Egyptian art reveals its greatest power. Their walls were adorned with rich and detailed scenes, painted in vibrant colors, the deep blue of the sky, the gold of the gods, and the green of fertile lands. These images had a single purpose: to ensure a safe and blessed passage into the afterlife. The tombs of pharaohs and nobles were true art galleries, filled with depictions of gods, judgment scenes, and glorious moments from the lives of those laid to rest. What is fascinating is that these images were not just created to glorify the deceased. They were designed to ensure that the spirit of the dead was recognized and well treated in the next world. as if art itself were the bridge connecting the living and the dead. Sculpture, capturing the divine and the mortal. Egyptian sculpture was, in many ways, a reflection of the order governing their society. It was not about capturing an individual's spontaneity, but about representing figures in an idealized and timeless manner. Pharaohs, gods, and even sacred animals were sculpted to reflect their status, power, and divine perfection. The statues were large and imposing, carved in stone, placed in temples and palaces. These figures were not mere portraits. They had a spiritual purpose. They embodied the presence of the gods or the pharaoh in the physical world. The famous statue of Ramses II at Abu Simbel, for example, was not just a masterpiece of sculpture. It was a symbol of eternal power, as if the pharaoh's image extended his divine strength. Colors and symbolism. The magic of color in Egypt. For the Egyptians, colors were not just decorative elements, but channels of energy and meaning. Blue represented the sky and the Nile, bringing fertility and vitality. Gold symbolized the sun, immortality, and the divine. Red was the color of chaos and war, while green conveyed the peace of fertile lands. Nothing in Egypt was random, and colors held immense symbolic power. When you looked at a painting or sculpture, you weren't just seeing a figure. You were witnessing the very essence of what it represented. Every shade, every stroke carried deep meaning. Jewelry, the shine of eternity. Egyptian jewelry is another dazzling facet of their art, a reflection of their belief in eternal life and divine power. Pharaohs and nobles wore necklaces, rings, and bracelets made of gold, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and precious stones, all adorned with symbols of protection and prosperity. But these jewels were not merely for displaying wealth. They were amulets, safeguarding their wearers in the afterlife. The Eye of Horus, for example, was a sacred amulet symbolizing protection and healing. Those who wore it believed they were under the watchful care of one of Egypt's most powerful gods. But the grandeur of Egyptian jewelry was not limited to the royal courts. Merchants, artisans, and farmers alike wore small amulets and symbolic jewelry because divine protection was for everyone, regardless of social status. Art as a gateway to the afterlife. Tombs and mausoleums. Egyptian art is perhaps most famous for its funerary monuments, the grand tombs of pharaohs. These were not mere physical structures, but sacred places where art served as the link between the world of the living and the dead. Inside the tombs, one would not only find sarcophagi, but also scenes of religious rituals, of kings and queens being welcomed by the gods, of treasures and offerings meant to secure an eternal existence. Egyptian funerary art sought to convey the idea of continuity, that death was only a new beginning. And we cannot forget the famous pyramids, which were tombs in their own right. These monumental structures served as symbols of the pharaoh's ascension to eternal life, reflecting the belief that art and architecture did not merely glorify a ruler's power, but ensured their divine transformation. Egyptian art, immortality in every stroke. The legacy of Egyptian art is eternal. Every image, every sculpture, every jewel carries a piece of the Egyptian soul, a belief that life, though temporary, is only preparation for true eternity. Art was not just an aesthetic expression, it was a spiritual and divine tool. And so, while the Egyptian civilization has faded into the sands of time, its works remain, immortal witnesses of a people who believed that art, more than anything else, could touch eternity. Decline and foreign conquests, the end of an era, the beginning of another ancient Egypt, that majestic and seemingly untouchable civilization that stood proud along the banks of the Nile for centuries, began to feel the weight of time. The grandeur that once dominated the world slowly yielded to internal instability and external threats. As central power weakened and pharaohs struggled to maintain authority, Egypt, once a giant, gradually found itself at the mercy of forces beyond its control. The waters of instability, Egypt's descent. In the early centuries of the late period, around the 8th century BCE, Egypt began to fragment. The kingdom that once ruled with an iron grip was now a divided land, torn between political intrigues, invasions, and the growing disregard for the pharaoh's authority. The dynasties weakened, and Egypt found itself battling not only external enemies, but also its own internal decay. But external threats, those relentless forces from distant lands, were not long in coming. Egypt was invaded by the Assyrians, the Persians, and, ultimately, the Greeks and Romans, with each conquest leaving its mark on the land of the pharaohs. The Persians, an empire with its eyes on the Nile. Before Alexander the Great, it was the Persian Empire that, on 2 occasions, conquered the land of the pharaohs as part of its vast expansion. Under Kings Cyrus and Darius, the Persians dominated Egypt and absorbed it into their empire. However, instead of completely erasing Egyptian culture, they allowed it to continue flourishing, even under Persian rule. But Egypt never stopped dreaming of independence. Even under Persian rule, various revolts and resistance movements emerged. The Egyptian people still felt the flame of their pharaonic identity, and this became evident when they managed for a time to expel the Persians and restore their autonomy. The arrival of Alexander, the Greek pharaoh. And then, like a sudden storm, in 332 BCE, Egypt met its fate at the hands of Alexander the Great, the young Macedonian conqueror whose ambition knew no bounds. Alexander did not arrive merely as a warrior, but as a symbol of what was to come, the end of independent pharaohs. When he marched into Egypt, he was not received as an invader, but as a liberator. The Egyptians, weary of instability, welcomed him as a messianic figure, and he, in turn, took possession of the land, founding the city of Alexandria, a name that would become synonymous with knowledge and culture. But the irony of this shift in power cannot be overlooked. Alexander the Great, the undefeated conqueror, became Egypt's last true pharaoh. When he was crowned, he did not just receive a king's crown, he assumed the mantle of a civilization that, until that moment, had been the epitome of stability and immortal power. Thus, the greatest paradox unfolded. A foreigner, a Macedonian, became the ruler of Egypt, marking the end of its independence. Alexander's legacy, a new era for Egypt. Although Alexander's conquest marked the end of Egypt's pharaonic rule, it did not signify the end of its greatness. On the contrary, his arrival ushered in an era of cultural fusion, where Greek and Egyptian traditions intertwined in powerful new ways. Alexander founded Alexandria, which would become an intellectual, scientific, and cultural hub, attracting thinkers, mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers from across the ancient world. Alexander the Great was not just a military conqueror, but also a great admirer of Egyptian culture. He presented himself as an Egyptian god, was crowned in Memphis, and associated himself with the divine lineage of the pharaohs. This merging of cultures, with Egyptian and Greek traditions blending together, laid the foundation for the Hellenistic period, which saw a fusion of architectural, philosophical, and religious styles. The end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last pharaoh, Cleopatra. After Alexander's death, Egypt fell under the control of his generals, but the most famous of them was Ptolemy I, who established the Ptolemaic dynasty. For centuries, the Ptolemies ruled Egypt, striving to maintain its traditions while incorporating Hellenistic influences. However, over time, the dynasty declined, and Egypt became increasingly vulnerable. Enter Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Her story is one of the most fascinating, marked by her struggle to preserve Egypt's independence against the rising power of Rome. In 30 BCE, after the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra by Octavian, Egypt officially became a Roman province, now sealing the final chapter of its sovereignty. The legacy of a civilization, the lesson of the Nile. Like the great river that sustained it, ancient Egypt's course was interrupted by the tides of foreign powers. But its mark, its art, its science, and its spirituality endured. Even under Greek and Roman rule, Egypt remained a source of wisdom and mystery. And like the pyramids, its legacy never faded. The Egypt of Alexander and the Ptolemies was no longer the same as the land of the ancient pharaohs, but in its temples, its monuments, and its timeless stories, the soul of Egypt continued to live on.